Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas with you today. My talk is titled Political Capitalism, How Economic and Political Power is Made and Maintained, and that's the title of a book that I published this past year. So what I'll be talking about are some of the ideas that are in that book. Now, if you go back to the 1940s, Friedrich Hayek wrote his most popular book, The Road to Serfdom, and according to Hayek, the road to serfdom was socialism. Around the same time, in the 1940s, Joseph Schumpeter wrote his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And in that book, he asked, can capitalism survive? No, I don't think so. What did he see as the threat? Socialism. So there's been this issue, capitalism versus socialism. Of course, this goes back to the Cold War era as well, where we envision socialism as the big threat to capitalism. In the United States today, many of you will be familiar with Bernie Sanders, who's running for president, an avowed socialist. And again, it looks like socialism is the big threat to capitalism. Certainly, if we look at the tradition of the Austrian School of Economics, we see that socialism is viewed as the threat to capitalism. There's this idea of capitalism at one extreme, socialism at the other, and we continually move to a more and more mixed economy over toward socialism. One of the messages I'm going to offer you today is that the biggest threat to capitalism isn't coming from the socialists. Rather, the biggest threat to capitalism comes from capitalists. And I'm going to talk about political capitalism as a distinct economic system. Political capitalism is an economic and political system in which the economic and political elite cooperate for their mutual benefit. The profitability of business is determined by political connections rather than the satisfaction of consumer preferences. And my argument is this is a separate and distinct economic system. It's not capitalism. It's not socialism. It's not a mixed economy that lies in between them. We need to understand political capitalism as a separate and distinct economic system. Political capitalism is widely recognized. It's widely opposed. People talk about cronyism, about corporatism, crony capitalism. President Eisenhower, when he was leaving office, warned about the military-industrial complex. So the symptoms of political capitalism are widely recognized, but not widely understood. So what I want to try to do today is to get down to thinking about how this economic system works, how political capitalism works, what are its underlying causes, because we're not going to be able to stop the march of political capitalism unless we understand its causes. Now, I mentioned to you before this idea of economic systems, capitalism on the one hand, socialism on the other, mixed economies in between. And that's a 20th century way of thinking about economic systems. And if you go back to the 20th century, the Cold War era, we had capitalist democracies opposing socialist dictatorships. So we had this tension between these two types of economic and political systems. And after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed by the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1992, Francis Fukuyama called that the end of history, in the sense that capitalism was the final evolution of economic systems, and democracy was the final evolution of political systems. I'm not so sure that's true. If we think about that 20th century way of thinking about economic and political systems, basically, the 20th century view was that economic systems and political systems are independent of each other. So we have this continuum from capitalism to socialism in economic systems with mixed economies in between. And in political systems, we have this continuum from dictatorship to democracy with mixed type of governments in between. And the 20th century idea there was that we can have any combination of these political and economic systems. If we think about the Cold War specifically, we had the capitalist democracies like the United States opposed to the communist dictatorships like the Soviet Union. But really, we could have any combination of those political and economic systems. Democratic socialism is one possibility. Sweden was often offered as an example of democratic socialism, and we might have capitalist dictatorships like fascism in Nazi Germany. Now, I don't think that's a very good characterization of those economic systems, so I'm not arguing this is the way we should characterize economic systems. I'm saying that's the way we did characterize economic systems in the 20th century. And that came from that Cold War era method of thinking, where we have these different political and economic systems and the tensions that existed in between them. Now, if you go back to the 20th century, it was very common for universities, economics departments, to offer courses in comparative economic systems. And comparative economic systems, the courses were basically a little bit about capitalism, a lot about socialism, and comparing capitalism and socialism as economic systems. As we move into the 1990s, those courses rapidly fell off the map. I think there are very few, at least in the United States, I don't know about in Europe, in the United States, there are very few universities that offer courses in comparative economic systems. In the 90s, those courses kind of shifted so that they were studying economies in transition rather than comparative economic system. So sort of following along the lines of Fukuyama, how is it that former socialist economies are transitioning into capitalist economies? And by the time we move into the 20th century, we have a different way of thinking about economic systems. In fact, in the 21st century, the way we tend to think about things is the market system is the economic system. And then there are various levels of interference with markets. So you have regulation and various levels of government interference with markets. But we don't really think about comparative economic systems the same way in the 21st century as we did back in the Cold War era in the 20th century. So what I'm arguing to you today is that we should go back to think about an economic systems approach to understanding economies, and that political capitalism should be understood as a distinct economic system. It's not part capitalism, it's not part socialism, it's not a mixed economy, it's a distinct economic system in itself. So what I'm going to give you today is a brief overview of the way that I'm thinking about political capitalism to try to understand it. As I said, it's widely recognized, but the factors underlying political capitalism are not widely understood. Now, talking about it being widely recognized, let me give you some examples. And I'll start with Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels say, each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. The bourgeoisie has at last since the establishment of modern industry and the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So that's a pretty good description of what I'm talking about with political capitalism. Now, Marx and Engels aren't the only people who have this idea. Here's Tom Morello. He's the guitarist in Rage Against the Machine. And in an interview in Guitar World, Tom Morello says, government basically has one function, and that is to serve the interests of the people who own the country. Let me move on to another economist, Murray Rothbard. In a recent book posthumously published by Rothbard, Rothbard says, increasing statism on a federal and state level can be better interpreted as a profitable alliance between certain business and industrial interests, looking for government to cartelize their industry. How often does it happen that Karl Marx and Murray Rothbard are on the same page here? Another quotation from Rothbard's The Progressive Era. Increasing statism on a federal and state level can be better interpreted as a profitable alliance between certain business and industrial interests looking for government to cartelize their industry. These are some examples of people who see this system of political capitalism. They're describing the way it works. And I want to give you a couple other examples. I think are kind of interesting examples. One is Joseph Stiglitz. This is from his 2012 book, The Price of Inequality. Stiglitz says, we have a political system that gives inordinate power to those at the top. And they have used that power not only to limit the extent of redistribution, but also to shape the rules of the game in their favor. That's political capitalism, as I'm talking about. Stiglitz says, it's one thing to win a fair game. It's quite another to be able to write the rules of the game and to write them in ways that enhance one's prospects of winning. And it's even worse when you can choose your own referees. I tend to think of Stiglitz as an economist on the political left end of the spectrum. But around the same time, David Stockman, who was a budget director for Ronald Reagan, and before that a Republican congressman, wrote his book, The Great Deformation. And Stockman says, we have a rigged system, a regime of crony capitalism. In truth, the historic boundary between the free market and the state has been eradicated, and therefore anything that can be peddled by crony capitalists is fair game. Now, the interesting thing here, if you read those two books by Stiglitz and by Stockman, up until they get to their policy conclusions, the ideas are almost interchangeable, right? I mean, they're talking about those same ideas. Now, their policy conclusions are different. That Stiglitz thinks we need more government oversight, we need more government regulation, we need more government control. Stockman says government is the problem, and we need less government in order to reduce this cronyism that he complains about. So their policy conclusions are different, but up until you get to the policy conclusions, it's really interesting to look at those two books side by side and see from political left to political right, you have these same ideas about cronyism in government, about what I'm calling political capitalism. Stiglitz and Stockman agree. Here's Stiglitz says, when one interest group holds too much power, it succeeds in getting policies that benefit itself rather than policies that would benefit the society as a whole. When the wealthiest use their political power to benefit excessively the corporations, they control much-needed resources, and much-needed resources are diverted into the pockets of a few instead of benefiting the society at large. That's Stiglitz. Stockman, talking about government, says our government is no longer a system of democratic choice and governance. It is a tyranny of incumbency and money politics. The gangs of crony capitalism will fight tooth and nail to preserve their slice of an imperiled pie, thereby disenfranchising even further ordinary taxpayers and citizens who have no voice in the Washington policy auctions. So it's really interesting to see the recognition of this idea of political capitalism from political left to political right. Basically, what all of these people are saying, there are two groups in society. There are the cronies, and then there's everybody else. Now, we use different words sometimes to identify those two groups. We talk about the cronies. Marx and Engels talked about the bourgeoisie. There's an extensive theory of elites that's been developed over the 20th century in political science and sociology. More recently, in the Occupy Wall Street movement, some of you will be familiar with this terminology, the 1% versus the 99%. The 1% are the elites. And then there's, on the everybody else, the proletariat, the masses, the 99%. Different words that we're using there, but we're really identifying that same political and economic system where there's one group who controls the system for their benefit, the elites, and then the masses, those are the people who oftentimes bear the costs. So what I try to do in my book is to build a theory of political capitalism, and I don't have to work too hard for the basic building blocks, because I'm going to take some basic building blocks that are well established in theories in economics, in political science, and in sociology. And the two basic components I'm going to use to discuss this theory of political capitalism, elite theory, that tells us who benefits, and public choice theory tells us how they benefit. Now, these theories by themselves don't really tell the complete story. Sociologists and political scientists have developed this idea of elite theory, the power elite. Some people control the system. Other people basically are subject to the system that the elites are controlling. But that elite theory doesn't explain how the elite are able to use the system for their benefit. Public choice theory does that. There are public choice theories of rent-seeking, of regulatory capture, of interest group politics that explain how some people are able to benefit at the expense of others. But where public choice theory stops short is it doesn't tell you the some people who benefit. Those are always the people in the same group, in the elite. They're the 1%. Those are the people who get the rents. Those are the people who capture the regulatory agencies. And one reason I think public choice theory doesn't do a good job of delineating that is that public choice theory, mainly developed by economists, takes a very individualistic approach to understanding economic and political processes. And so as a result, public choice theory doesn't tend to think in terms of groups. And I'll just take a quotation out of James Buchanan and Gordon Tulloch's book, The Calculus of Consent, to illustrate this. Buchanan and Tulloch say that they reject any theory or conception of the collectivity which embodies the exploitation of a ruled by a ruling class. This includes the Marxist vision, which incorporates the polity as one means through which the economically dominant group imposes its will on the downtrodden. But what I'm arguing today is there is an economically dominant group that does impose its will on the downtrodden. And so I want to break away from this individualistic approach that public choice theory is taking by combining public choice theory with elite theory. Now, there's already a strong economic foundation for elite theory. One place that you see that, Mansur Olson's book, The Logic of Collective Action, where he explains how smaller groups are better able to organize in order to use the system for their advantage, oftentimes at the cost of larger groups that have a higher cost of organization. Buchanan and Tulloch, who reject the idea of elites dominating masses, nevertheless talk about log rolling and political exchanges that benefit those people who are engaged in the exchanges. But most people are not in a good position to engage in those political exchanges. So this elite theory, it's been developed in political science, in sociology, hasn't really made its way into economics. But one thing I want to argue to you is that elite theory has a very solid economic basis in the Coase theorem. So, the Coase theorem, one way to state the Coase theorem, a lot of you will be familiar with the Coase theorem already. One way to state the Coase theorem is, in the absence of transaction costs, resources are allocated to their highest valued uses. And the logic behind that, let me start with the absence of transaction costs. What does the absence of transaction costs mean? It means that there's nothing standing in the way of people engaging in mutually advantageous exchanges. So if there's no transaction costs, then there's nothing standing in the way of everybody engaging in every possible mutually advantageous exchange. So in the absence of transaction costs, resources go to their highest valued uses. Why is that the case? Because the people who value resources the most can buy them. And there's no transaction cost that's standing in the way of those transactions taking place. Now, fortunate me, because of modern prosperity, I own an automobile. So let me ask you this. Of all of the people in the world, it's more than 7 billion people in the world. So of all of those 7 billion people in the world, which one of those 7 billion people do you think places the highest value on my automobile? Who is it that values it the most out of those 7 billion people? Well, in the absence of transaction costs, resources go to their highest valued use. So I'm going to say I value the car the most. I value my automobile more than anybody else. And why am I saying that? Because if somebody else valued it more, they'd make me an offer and buy it from me. Now, actually, that may not be exactly true, because the Coase theorem says in the absence of transaction costs, there may be some transaction cost that's keeping somebody from making that exchange. But if there were no transaction costs, I would be the person who valued my car the most, because if somebody else valued it more, they would buy it from me. Now, here's the thing. Now, when Coase wrote his article, he was writing this article, The Problem of Social Cost, which is an extremely insightful article. He was writing about the externalities literature at the time. The article was published in 1960. And he was writing about the externalities literature at the time. But let's think about that Coase theorem as applied to externalities, because that's how Coase was applying his idea. So basically, Coase's argument was, in the absence of transaction costs, resources go to their highest valued use. If there's an externality, if there were no transaction costs, people could bargain among themselves to internalize the externality so that there would be no external cost. So think of it like the traditional example of an externality, a factory that's producing smoke. We have a steel mill that's polluting the air. And we have the steel producers selling steel to the automobile manufacturer. They have low transaction costs. They can bargain with each other. In the absence of transaction costs, the people who are breathing the polluted air would be able to make a bargain with the steel mill to reduce their pollution. But the problem is there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people who are breathing the polluted air. Transaction costs are high, so they are not able to engage in a bargain, and so the externality persists. Right? So think about the way that things are going on here with the steel mill. You have a low transaction cost group, the steel manufacturer, the auto manufacturer. They're able to engage in trade. They have low transaction costs. They can allocate resources to the highest valued uses to themselves, to the people who are in the low transaction cost group. Meanwhile, other people who face high transaction costs, they're breathing the polluted air. They have costs imposed on them. They're in the high transaction cost group. They have costs imposed on them by the people in the low transaction cost group. Okay, so that's the way things work with thinking about economic externalities. Now, let's apply the Coase theorem to the political process. In the political process, you have a few people who face low transaction costs, and they can bargain with each other. People in the legislature, in the parliament, other government officials, well-connected lobbyists. Those people engage in political exchange. They trade votes. They bargain with each other to allocate resources to the highest valued use for the people in the low transaction cost group. Most people are in a high transaction cost group, unable to bargain. The people in the high transaction cost group just have to accept the policies that are passed by the people in the low transaction cost group. So somebody like me, basically I have no political power. So, if laws can be proposed and whatever, I might say, no, I don't like that law, but I don't have any power. That's not going to change the way things are. So I'm guessing a lot of you are in the same position where whatever the government does, basically you have no power to change that. There are some people who do. They're in the low transaction cost group, people in the parliament, government officials and so forth. Those are the people in the low transaction cost group who maximize the value of resources to themselves. And just like the people who are breathing the polluted air in the market example, most people in the masses face high transaction costs, and so they're unable to do anything in response if government places costs on them. So a key part of my argument in understanding political capitalism is applying the Coase theorem to see that the Coase theorem provides an economic foundation for understanding elite theory. And so, applying the Coase theorem, we see basically there are two groups of people in the economy. We have the bourgeoisie, the elite, the 1%. Those are the people in the low transaction cost group. Those are the fat cats. And then there are people in the high transaction cost group. The proletariat, the masses, the 99%. Those are the people in the high transaction cost group. So from an economic standpoint, the way to understand elite theory is to see it as the elite, the 1%, the bourgeoisie. Those are the people in the low transaction cost group. They make public policy. Most people, the masses, they're in the high transaction cost group. So from an economic standpoint, we look at two groups of people. Some people are in the low transaction cost group. Some people are in the high transaction cost group. Now, public choice theory explains, some people engage in rent seeking. They get rents. There are some people who capture regulatory agencies and so forth. But public choice theory pretty much stops there. If we combine public choice theory with elite theory, we see that systematically there's one group of people who get the rents. There's one group of people who are able to capture the regulatory agencies. There's one group of people who are the special interests who get policies to go their way. Those are the people in the low transaction cost group. So we combine elite theory with public choice theory, and we get a pretty good understanding about the way that political capitalism works. And so that's what I do in my book, is combine those two theories, but I don't have to start from scratch in developing a theory of political capitalism, because I already have these building blocks, elite theory and public choice theory, and when you put them together, they do a pretty good job of explaining this system of political capitalism. Now, one thing to see is that there is a discontinuity in political power. Some people face low transaction costs. They participate in public policy. Most people face high transaction costs. They have no say. Voters are rationally ignorant because they know their one vote doesn't count. And here, this is Anthony Downs over here on your left. Anthony Downs is the author of An Economic Theory of Democracy. Ronald Coase is there in the center. And one of the ideas in Downs' book, An Economic Theory of Democracy, is voters are rationally ignorant because they know their one vote doesn't count. You know, when you cast your vote, that's not going to determine the outcome of an election, so you don't have any incentive to become informed. In the last presidential election in the United States, if I had voted for Donald Trump would be president. If I had voted for Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump would be president. And if I didn't vote at all, Donald Trump would be president. I just have one vote. My vote is not going to have any impact on the election. And there's no good way for me to get more political power. So there's a discontinuity in political power that's not the case with economic power. With economic power, there's pretty much a continuum. Some people have more economic power than others. But there's a continuum in economic power from least powerful to the most powerful. So let's say I don't have very much economic power. I have a low-paying job. I want to get more economic power. Is there any way that I could do that? Well, maybe I could work overtime and just get a little more money. I'd have a little bit more economic power. Maybe I could take a second job. I could earn more income. I'd have a little more economic power. Maybe I could improve my human capital. I could get a higher paying job and I'd have a little more economic power. So certainly some people have more economic power than others, but there's a continuum. So if you have $20, you have twice the economic power of somebody with $10. If you have $10 million, you have 10 times the economic power of somebody with $1 million. There's a continuum there. And when Bill Gates walks into Starbucks with his $10, that $10 carries just as much weight as when you walk into Starbucks with your $10. So there's a continuum in economic power. Not so in political power. There's a discontinuity in political power. Most people have no political power. That's the masses. And a few people, the elites, have a lot of political power. But political power isn't continuous in the same way that economic power is continuous. So let's say I have no political power. That's pretty realistic. And I want to get more political power. What could I do? Well, I could contribute to some candidate's campaign. I could give money to a political party. I could volunteer my time to work for a party or a candidate. And I would still have no political power. Right. So I can't really marginally adjust there. I mean, I can do some little things to try to help out one candidate or one party, but that's not going to give me any more political power. There's a discontinuity in political power that doesn't exist with economic power, where economic power is more continuous. And you see that again in this concept of rational ignorance. Citizens are rationally ignorant because they know that individually they have no impact on political power. So that whole idea of rational ignorance in politics is built upon the fact that people know that their opinion is not going to change political outcomes. So if we think about political capitalism, look at political capitalism this way. There's a low transaction cost group. They design public policy to maximize the benefit to people in their group. And then there's a high transaction cost group, and just like people who suffer the negative effects of externalities in markets because they face high transaction cost group, they face high transaction costs, people in politics, the masses face high transaction costs, so they often bear the costs of public policy. It's not necessarily that the elite want to impose costs on the masses. It's just a byproduct of their doing what's in their own advantage, right? I mean, the steel mill isn't saying, I'm going to pollute the air of all of these people who live around the steel mill. No, it's just a byproduct of their own economic activity. And the same thing is true in politics. It's not that the elite are trying to impose costs on the masses. No, what they're trying to do is to maximize benefits to themselves, and in the process, the masses often bear the cost. And so we end up having a system where the economic and political elite cooperate for their mutual benefit, and increasingly the profitability of business is determined by political connections rather than by the satisfaction of consumer preferences. So political capitalism is not the welfare state. You know, and we're thinking we want to preserve capitalism. What are the challenges that we face? It isn't the welfare state. It's not big government. It's not a mixed economy. It's not government intervention in a market economy. It's a political system that's defined by what government does is defined by the relationship between the economic and political elite rather than any of these other things that are often held out as the big threats to capitalism. Now, if we compare market capitalism with political capitalism, in market capitalism, profitability is based on satisfying consumer preferences. In political capitalism, profitability is based on political connections. But both market capitalism and political capitalism are based on private ownership of the means of production. It's not socialism where the government takes control of things. No, it's private ownership of the means of production so that the economic elite can benefit from policies determined by the government. Both of them are based on the market for goods and services. And I'll emphasize, some of capitalism's most vocal proponents support business-friendly policies like tax breaks, subsidies, regulatory protections, trade barriers. Pretty much when you hear somebody say, here's a policy that's pro-business policies are anti-market policies, anti-free market. So how is it that political capitalism has been able to edge its way in and challenge market capitalism? Progressive democracy is the political foundation for political capitalism. If you go back to the classical liberal view of government, in particular, I tend to think about the United States because I'm from the United States, and the founding fathers in the United States had a vision of government that protected individual rights. Okay, so the idea, what's the role of government? According to the American founders, it's to protect individual rights. And as we move toward the end of the 1800s, this progressive ideology became established, and progressivism essentially views the role of government as a bit larger. The progressive ideology says that the role of government is not only to protect individual rights, but also to look out for the economic well-being of its citizens. From the beginning, progressivism was an ideology that justified imposing costs on some for the benefit of others. And in particular, if you think about the progressivism becoming established in the United States in the late 1800s, the villains there were the so-called robber barons, these capitalists like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Carnegie and so forth. And the way that people were viewing this is that they were using their economic power to take advantage of people who had less economic power. And so the progressive ideology said it's okay to impose costs on those people for the benefit of the masses, right? So we'll impose costs on some, the so-called robber barons, these capitalists, will impose costs on some for the benefit of others. Okay, and the same thing if we look at the establishment of European welfare states, which actually the European welfare states predated the American welfare state. But the progressive ideology explicitly says it's okay to impose costs on some people for the benefit of others. So we have the welfare programs, we have the progressive taxation, and so forth. So the whole ideology of progressivism says it's okay for public policy to impose costs on some for the benefit of others. And then there's the ideology of democracy. And the ideology of democracy justifies a democratic government as carrying out the will of its citizens. And how do we know the will of its citizens? It's revealed through a democratic decision-making process. There are two ways that we might look at democracy. One way that we might look at democracy, it's a way to peacefully replace those who exercise the power of government. So government has certain limited powers. This was certainly the view of the American founders who set up a constitutionally limited government. And the role of democracy is it's a method of peacefully replacing the people who hold political power. But there's another more modern view of democracy, and that is that democratic government carries out the will of the people as determined by the outcome of a democratic decision-making process. So we look at progressive democracy, and the ideology of progressivism says it's okay for public policy to impose costs on some people for the benefit of others. The ideology of democracy says when a democratic government does this, it's carrying out the will of the people. But now let's think about this in the context of political capitalism. So often the 99%, the masses say, here's a problem, the government needs to do something. But who is it that makes government policy? It's the 1%. Right? So you have a situation where the 99% is saying government policy is taking advantage of us for the benefit of the 1%. So let's give the 1% even more power and see if maybe this time they'll use it to our advantage rather than their advantage. No, I mean, that's not going to happen. Progressive democracy provides the political foundation for political capitalism. And as I mentioned before, one thing I want everybody to take away, capitalists are capitalism's biggest enemies. Joseph Schumpeter asked, can capitalism survive? No, I don't think it can, he said. His reasoning was that the people who most benefited from capitalism wouldn't support it. And you see this, I imagine you see it in, all the countries you people are from. I especially see it in the United States. When capitalists go to government to ask government to implement policies, are they saying we want a free market? Are they saying, let the market work? No, they're going to government, they're saying we want a subsidy. We want a tax break. We want regulatory protection. We want trade barriers for our company. So capitalists don't stand up for capitalism. When they enter the political process, they're arguing their own narrow interests. They're saying they want government to provide specific benefits to them. And so Schumpeter says, thus the capitalist process pushes into the background all those institutions, the institutions of property and free contracting in particular, that express the needs and wants of truly private economic activity. Here's Schumpeter again. Capitalism tends to wear away protective strata, to break down its own defenses, to disperse the garrisons of its entrenchments. And he says down below, the bourgeois fortress thus becomes politically defenseless. Defenseless fortresses invite aggression, especially if there is rich booty in them. So Schumpeter's pretty pessimistic there. Schumpeter again, the capitalist process not only destroys its own institutional framework, but also creates the conditions for another. Destruction may not be the right word after all. Perhaps I should have spoken of transformation. Now, Schumpeter's concerned about a transformation from capitalism to socialism, but what I'm suggesting to you today is that transformation appears to be from market capitalism to political capitalism. I mean, the problem with socialism is you're taking away the property of the economic elite. And the benefits they get from political capitalism comes from their ownership of economic resources. So the economic elite, I mean, they're not in favor of moving in a direction that takes away their resources. That transformation that we see occurring is a transformation from market capitalism to political capitalism. Here's Schumpeter again. The essential point to grasp is that in dealing with capitalism, we are dealing with an evolutionary process. It may seem strange that anyone can fail to see so obvious a fact. Capitalism, then, is by its nature a form or method of economic change that not only never is, but never can be stationary. And so in this evolutionary process, what I'm wondering here is, are we moving from market capitalism to political capitalism? The next couple slides I have here might be more along the lines for an American audience. I cite Ludwig von Mises here, and Mises is talking about people who view some sort of idealistic society. And he says, social problems were considered ethical problems. What was needed in the vision of people who were social reformers, what was needed in order to construct the ideal society, they thought, was good princes and virtuous citizens. With righteous men, any utopia might be realized. And so when I think about this in the context of the most recent American political election, it's kind of interesting that Donald Trump referred to Hillary Clinton. He's often called her lying Hillary. So here's Mises talking about good princes and virtuous citizens. I guess Hillary's a princess, but lying Hillary, no, not a good prince. And meanwhile, Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. So, again, going back to Mises, virtuous citizens? No, Hillary Clinton is saying they're a basket of deplorables. So anyways, just kind of applies Mises' idea to American politics. So, how can political capitalism be controlled? And I could go into another hour or so in talking about this, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to mention a few possibilities and think about them in the context of what I've told you already today. So how do we control political capitalism? One answer might be constitutional constraints. I take this idea from my own teacher, James Buchanan, who is very high on constitutional constraints. So I was a student of James Buchanan. I wrote my doctoral dissertation under him. And so I sort of talk about my teacher, James Buchanan, but kind of in the context of Frank Knight. Buchanan called Frank Knight his teacher. I never, ever heard Buchanan say just Frank Knight. He never said that. He always said my teacher, Frank Knight. It was always 4 words. My teacher, Frank Knight. Well, anyways, my teacher, James Buchanan, said constitutional constraints. But see, there's a problem with constitutional constraints. Somebody has to enforce them. Right? And so we could go into that more, but I'm not going to. Another possibility, democratic oversight. Right? Ultimately, because of democratic elections, we, the people, control the government. But I've already suggested to you the problem there, that voters are rationally ignorant, voters have no power, the masses know they have no power. People who have no power are not in a position to control people who have power. And so that leads to checks and balances. And this is an idea, it goes back at least to the American founders, but probably before. So it's pretty well recognized, but I don't think it's sufficiently appreciated the way that we need to design checks and balances into our government. So you have different groups in government who have different powers and who also have different interests, so that they check and balance each other. And if this elite theory that I've been talking about, if that's descriptive of our actual political and economic system, the masses cannot control the elites. Democratic oversight is not going to work. The masses can't control the elites. But with checks and balances, you can have some elites in a position to control, to check and balance the power of other elites. So I really think the political answer to controlling political capitalism lies in checks and balances. Now, I do want to say one thing about, about the name political capitalism, because, pretty good. I've had a little bit of pushback on the name. People don't like me using the term political capitalism because they say it's giving capitalism a bad name. So call it cronyism or, but it's giving capitalism a bad name. And that, maybe that's right. But I would say both political capitalism and market capitalism, they're enabled by private ownership of the means of production and elite control of the political process in the case of political capitalism. It may also be a good term because capitalism might have the tendency to evolve into political capitalism. That's what a lot of people seem to think. I gave you so many quotations at the beginning of my talk. It might be a good term because the biggest threat to capitalism are the policies proposed by pro-business capitalist proponents. People say, I want to support business. They supporting trade barriers, tariffs, regulatory barriers. Pro-business people, as I said before, if anybody says policies are pro-business, typically what they mean is anti-free market. And we need to understand the system if we're able if we want to be able to control it. So let me just give you a few summary points here. First of all, elite theory, a key building block of the theory of political capitalism. It explains why government policy benefits the elite rather than the masses. And the Coase theorem provides an economic foundation for elite theory. Elite theory explains who benefits. Public choice theory explains how they benefit. And so the result is political capitalism, where the political and economic elite conspire for their own advantage. Profit becomes increasingly the result of political connections rather than producing value for consumers. Political capitalism is facilitated by the ideology of progressive democracy. Imposing costs on some for the benefit of others, that's the foundation of progressivism. And when this is done through a democratic process, the ideology of democracy says they're carrying out the will of the people. So when a democratic government carries out these policies of political capitalism, when Donald Trump says we're imposing tariffs on and so forth, it's done by a democratic government, legitimizes what they're doing. Progressivism says it's okay to impose costs on some people for the benefit of others. It's progressive democracy provides the political foundation for political capitalism. And capitalism's biggest enemies are its proponents, the pro-business people who are proposing policies that benefit themselves rather than promote free markets. Political capitalism is not the welfare state, it's not big government, it's not socialism. It's a system where the political and economic elite cooperate for their mutual benefit. And we're not going to be able to control that system unless we understand it. And so the goal of my work here, the goal of my talk, the goal of my book is to try to explain and understand how that system of political capitalism works. So I hope I've interested you in these ideas to a degree. And it's a cover of my book. And I will say, my publisher has given me some brochures here. They're up front. If you're interested in getting a copy of the book at a 20% discount, I have some brochures up here in the front that you can pick up, and you can get the book at a 20% discount if you're interested. Anyway, so that's what I have to say about political capitalism, and I'm happy to open the floor to questions, comments, and discussion. Yeah, thank you, Roderick, for that comment. It's a good comment, and I agree with you entirely. There's a nice book. I wish I could remember the author. It's called The Governmental Habit. I don't know. I don't remember the author of it right offhand. But it documents American history, but it documents from the founding of the United States the heavy involvement of the economic and political elite for their mutual benefits. So I agree with you entirely on that. And I think it. And even if you go back before that, I mean, so you go back to feudal systems, and even back in the Roman Empire, political and economic power were held by the same people. So you had that sort of thing, and so we had a brief period following the Enlightenment where it seems like government sort of faded more into the background. Free trade and freedom in general came to the forefront. So we do see that kind of movement in the 1800s. But I agree with what you're saying, that cooperation between the economic and political elite is long-standing. And even, you don't have to go back too much in history before the economic elite and the political elite are the exact same people. So thank you for the comment.
balances. They have low inflation. There is a system. So what prevents them from trading instead of chickens?
So those are good questions. Checks and balances. What was the first one?
Is it ever possible if 1%?
Oh, yeah.
Is it ever possible to like the minimum?
Yeah, I think pretty much it's not possible for power to be more widely spread. And the reason for that is that once you get beyond groups of a certain size, it's difficult for those groups to negotiate and bargain with each other. So we could imagine, let's say, a parliament that has 500 people in it. And so that's not a real big number, and so they can bargain and negotiate with each other, although even there sometimes it's through party organizations and middlemen. But it's hard to imagine a parliament of, let's say, 10,000 people, where each one of those people is able to bargain and make their voices heard. So I think just because of transaction costs, that prevents us from having a larger group of people with political power. And then with the checks and balances, it's a tricky thing to develop institutions such that checks and balances actually work. And in the United States, I see checks and balances continually eroding. We have a separation of powers in the United States, a constitutional separation of powers. A part of that is that it's Congress, the legislative branch, that declares war in the United States. We haven't had a declared war since World War II. I'm pretty sure. No, maybe the Korean War. Vietnam War, no. Afghanistan, Iraq, so our forces are fighting over there. But not only, we don't have a declared war, but Congress gave its power to the president to engage in those military operations. So that's an example of a breakdown of checks and balances. I mean, with the way I read the Constitution, President Bush sending troops over into Iraq and Afghanistan appears to me to be unconstitutional because that's the power of Congress, not the power of the president. But they gave up that power. So I think that the problem he raises is a very real problem, that it may be that those elites who are supposed to check and balance each other end up cooperating for their mutual benefit. I don't think we've seen that happen as much in the United States in the legislative branch. In the judicial branch. So you look at the judicial branch, they've been pretty independent in exercising their power to control both the executive and legislative branches. But that's not the case in every country. I mean, in a lot of countries, the judicial branch is basically an arm of the executive branch. The judicial branch does what the executive branch wants. So I think you raise a very real problem, which is we try to design a system of checks and balances, but those people who have the divided political power find a way to get together and cooperate for their mutual benefit. So we have that system of checks and balances breaking down.
Before I begin, I would like to say I love the word that you chose to describe the phenomenon for two reasons. One's kind of superficial, but I find the word cronyism to be rather aesthetically ugly. And the second, because it opens up this door. It's not explicitly ideological, so it allows people across the ideological line to talk about this without showing one's colours too early. But I was wondering, as the main point, whether there are some, whether public choice, facts, or philosophical observations that we could use in order to kind of limit this phenomenon. The first would be something like the decentralization or localization of power.
Yeah.
people would allow the average person to have more political power than they might have had in the past?
Yeah, those are good questions. Let me address the second question first. It's true that with modern technologies, voters can get more information, but that doesn't give them more power. I mean, just because I, as a voter, know more, doesn't give me any greater ability to control what's going on. And so a lot of people are interested in politics and they collect up information. The same thing is true of sports. You know, people collect up information about their favorite teams and they'll cheer for their favorite teams. Not going to affect the outcome of the match, but nevertheless, some people are interested in politics, some people are interested in sports. I guess it would be better if people were better informed, but ultimately, you know, each individual voter just having one vote, it's still going to be true that one voter is not going to have any influence on the outcome. So, you know, maybe there's some reason for optimism there through technology, but I think a limited amount of optimism. As for local control, if we move things more locally, I think that's a good suggestion, but I'm not sure that it really controls the cronyism and corruption. And I know, I mean, in the United States, there's a long history of cronyism and corruption that's well known in major cities like New York and Chicago. And it's also taking place in smaller cities like my own city of Tallahassee. Excuse me. Right now, the FBI has concluded an investigation of a former city commissioner in Tallahassee who's under indictment. And just give you an example of the way things work here. This actually happened in Tallahassee, Florida, where I live. There is a guy who was a mayor of the Tallahassee for a while. He left government. He didn't have an official office. He started up a consulting firm. And his consulting firm was called Governance Incorporated. And so he was doing political consulting. Well, then he ran for and was elected to city commission. And so he transferred his firm, Governance Incorporated, to the ownership of his girlfriend. And I'll also just say he's married at the time, but nevertheless his girlfriend got the firm, Governance Incorporated. So it's a lobbying firm that used to belong to the commissioner, but now it belongs to his girlfriend. So businesses would come to the commissioner and say, you know, we'd like to get a license to do such and such, or we'd like to accomplish this. And the commissioner would say, if you want to be, you know, effective in trying to get this done, the best thing you can do is to hire Governance Incorporated as a consultant for you to help them to do this. And so these businesses who, you know, wanted a government contract or, well, you know, whatever, they would pay Governance Incorporated, which is owned by the commissioner's girlfriend, in order to get access to the commissioner. What do you think? Is that on the up and up? Anyways, the FBI investigated. The FBI brought charges against him. And so he's coming to trial for that corruption, the cronyism. You know, so we're basically he's saying, I mean, the city commissioner is saying, if you want to get anything done, you pay my girlfriend. Otherwise, no deal. So, and that's an example from a local government in a relatively small town. So I think it's promising to look to more local, less national governments, but at the same time, oftentimes that just localizes the corruption as opposed to eliminating it.